Okay, I believe we're recording now. Good evening, everyone. Okay, so we're starting off this webinar tonight with a quick lightning true false section as we give folks a few minutes to shuffle in. So Meera, are you ready for lightning true false?
Yeah, go ahead, go for it.
Okay, question number one, or true false number one. The more you take Plan B, the more adverse effects and the less effective it becomes.
So that is false. It does. If you take Plan B once and you take it again, the efficacy is still the same. The way in which it works, so we think the way it works is that it delays ovulation. So it'll just keep delaying ovulation, and and Plan B is a method of a emergency contraception and should be taken within 5 days of an active condomless sex.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Question number two. Abortion can affect fertility and cause infertility, later on.
So that is also false. So abortion does not in any way impact fertility or your ability to get pregnant in the future.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Number three. The majority of abortions occur in the third trimester, otherwise known as late-term abortions.
So that is false. The majority of abortions occur in the first trimester, so before 13 weeks, and even within the first trimester, the majority happen before about 8 weeks. Also, I just want to point out that late-term abortion is not actually a medical term. That is a term that was created by the anti-abortion movement to trigger people. And it's not something that we use. But abortion does happen in any trimester for reasons that are unique to the individual who are seeking that care.
Thank you for sharing that. Number four, what your medical provider is mandated to say before an abortion procedure is developed by a consortium of health professionals.
So I will say yes and no. So there are, in some states, medical providers are mandated to say things to the patient, and many of those things are not true, and they're written by lawmakers. So yes, that part is false. I will say that the counseling that we provide for patients seeking abortion care, that abortion providers who are compassionate providers who are wanting to provide patients with the best care possible, are rooting all of their counseling from and in evidence-based science. And so that, in that sense, I will say that that counseling is really, I guess, stems from healthcare professionals and the literature that's been developed. So
makes sense. Thank you for offering that nuance.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. There are two different ways to get a safe abortion.
So true, in that there's the procedural abortion and then there's the medication abortion. So procedural abortion is it's a quick procedure that's done in the procedure room in an outpatient setting for the most part. In some cases, it has to be done in a hospital setting, but that's more rare. And then the other method is a medication abortion, which involves a series of pills that the individual takes at home.
All right. And procedural abortions, which you just referenced, are safe and can be completed in 15 minutes or less?
Yes, that is true. And usually they take, I would say, less than 5 minutes for the most part.
Interesting.
Yeah.
In the US, minors cannot receive reproductive care or an abortion without parental consent or permission from a judge.
So that is true in many states, but false in some states. So, I'm in New York, and young people, so minors, are allowed to receive the full spectrum of sexual and reproductive health care without receiving consent from a parent or a guardian. However, there are in some states laws that require minors to either bring a parent or a guardian for the abortion procedure or seek judicial bypass from a judge in a court, saying, that the judge says, yeah, you can have the abortion without having your parent or guardian involved. The interesting thing is that in order to continue a pregnancy, you don't actually need parental consent. But in order to not continue a pregnancy, it is required to either have the judge or the parent or the guardian.
Interesting. And so that's state by state.
Yes, state by state.
Got it. Okay. So federally, that's not the case.
Right.
Okay. Certain hospitals have different policies and practices depending on their religious affiliation and values. Some of this question is cut off for me. Ones that often affect patients seeking reproductive care.
That is true. Yep.
Condoms are more effective as a birth control method than withdrawal or pulling out.
Yes. Condoms are a barrier protection, so they not only protect against unintended pregnancy, but they also protect against sexually transmitted infections. Yep.
And IUDs are the most effective form of birth control.
Well, the one thing I want to say about pulling out is that people knock it, but it is also 70% effective. So even though it's not the most effective, it is a method.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. IUDs are the most effective form of birth control. So I have a feeling you're going to say this is true, which is true. However, there is if we're getting into the weeds of this, technically, by percentage wise, the Nexplanon, which is a little rod that we insert to the arm, is technically the most effective method of contraception that we have on the market today. But I mean, they basically go head to head. I don't, if a patient really asks me which one, and they're like, really need to know the exact details, I'll say Nexplanon, but I wouldn't push one over the other based on efficacy alone, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. And thank you for sharing that. Reproductive healthcare professionals are required to detailed explanation of the most common birth control options that are available, their effectiveness, and their side effects.
Yeah. Yes.
That's true?
True, yes.
Okay, we thought that was false, so that's why you're here.
Well, hold on one second. Well, okay, so I think I know why you're saying false, meaning like in theory, what people who are supportive of sexual reproductive health care and abortion care and reproductive health care access, will provide education around all the methods of contraception and talk about efficacy, side effects, and tailor all of that to patient preferences. Now, in certain states, I would say that's not necessarily like mandated. So in that sense, I'm thinking that that's where you're getting at with this question, but they should be providing like information to patients so that they feel empowered to make those decisions and that they feel like they have all the information to make those decisions. But that's unfortunately not always the case.
Yeah, that's good to know. It's nice to hear that definitely does happen in many settings. Yeah. Last question. There are many variations of the pill, and patients can work with a gynecologist to seek out the one that fits their needs.
Yeah, there's many different types of pills, different doses, and different sort of, the way you can take it. There's ones where you can, where you find yourself having a monthly bleed or a period 4 times a year instead of once a month, and ones with higher doses, lower doses of hormones. So yeah, definitely. And then there's, similar to the pill, there's the patch, there's the ring, which are similar in that they have both estrogen and progesterone, and they're just administered differently than the pill. Where the pill is taken orally, the patch is put on the body, and the ring is inserted into the vagina. So,
all right, makes sense. Thank you for doing lightning true false with us. I hope that offers just like a nice little intro to folks, and really appreciate you being here to be an expert and offer us that nuance that goes beyond just true and false. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and hello. My name is Veda Kamra and I'm the Senior Communications Associate at Sakhi. We are a 32-year-old gender justice organization that serves survivors of violence from the South Asian diaspora in New York City. Tonight, we at Sakhi are fortunate to have this opportunity to chat more about the book that inspired this conversation. You're the only one I've told the stories behind abortion with the author herself. I actually have a copy of the book right here. If you haven't had a chance yet to read Dr. Meera Shah's book, you can find it at the link in the chat, and proceeds from this book are being donated to promote reproductive health access, just so you know. Of course, there's so much stigma around talking about abortion in general, but the narrative in the States is also dominated by cis white voices. This conversation seeks to add bi-POC, immigrant, and gender expansive perspectives to that narrative, and to instill others with the courage to discuss their own experiences with abortion and reproductive health care. Furthermore, we make to see clear, as Dr. Shah does in her book, that abortion is an all-gender issue. The title of this event, Abortion is Everyone's Problem, the Urgency of Intersectional Reproductive Rights, intends to uplift the problems that we see surrounding abortion, namely the inaccessibility, inequity, and stigma that accompany reproductive health care in this country. We're honored to be in conversation with Dr. Shah, as well as Pooja Raj of Sakhi and Nabila Rashid Hart. Dr. Meera Shah is a family medicine physician practicing in New York, currently as the Chief Medical Officer at Planned Parenthood Hudson-Peconic, where she also serves as the National Medical Spokesperson for Planned Parenthood Federation of America. A fellow with the Physicians for Reproductive Health, Shah is dedicated to being a vocal advocate for sexual and reproductive health access for all people. She also serves on the board of Whole Women's Health Alliance. Pooja Raj is Associate Director of Counseling and Youth at Sakhi. She has a long-standing history with Sakhi and rejoined the team as a counselor in February of 2019. She graduated from Columbia University with a master's in social work with a focus on clinical social work and international social welfare in 2014. Prior to Sakhi, Pooja provided trauma-informed services to survivors of the Holocaust and worked abroad with refugees from Syria. She is fluent in Punjabi, Hindi, and Urdu. And Nabila Rashid is a queer Bangladeshi American trauma-informed forensic social worker, community educator, and gender-based violence consultant. In 2019, she joined HEART, where she's the Outreach and Community Engagement Manager. Before HEART, Nabila was consulting for public defenders, government agency staff, and nonprofits to support in creating safer spaces for victims and survivors, either through organizational programming or one-to-one case management. Nabila also co-founded the Cathartis, in 2012, a web-based platform for victims and survivors, allies, and co-conspirators to find a safe, judgment-free home for their storytelling as a part of their journey on coping and healing. She earned her master's in social work from Long Island University, Brooklyn, a post-bac degree in biology from University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and a BS in health science and creative writing from the University of Sciences in Philadelphia. Nabila currently straddles life between Brooklyn and Northern Virginia. So thank you, Dr. Shah, Pooja, and Nabila for being with us here tonight. I just wanted to say to the audience, if at any point during this conversation you experience anxiety, discomfort, or any other intense emotions, please feel free to step back or step away. We also encourage you to check out our wellness guide, a community mental health resource that was developed by our team. The link for that is in the chat. And finally, if this conversation brings up anything that you would like to share with a Sakhi advocate, please do reach out to us at 212-868-6741, and that number will also be in the chat. So without further ado, let's jump right into the conversation. So one thing that struck me as I was thinking about this is that something that differentiates our work at Sakhi from repro rights work is that gender-based violence tends to be a far more bipartisan issue, whereas abortion and thus reproductive health care has been highly politicized. Yet the conversation and legislation around abortion have been dominated by cis white voices and very often men. And to that end, it's worth noting that abortion was condoned during colonial times. Restrictions first popped up in the US in the 1820s and expanded as a white male-dominated medical field sought to standardize itself and subsequently restrict midwives and doulas from their ranks by criminalizing abortion. Dr. Shah, I wonder, would you walk us through a bit of the evolution of abortion restrictions, particularly in the late 20th century, and how that affects us today?
Yeah, definitely. So it's a big question, and I'll try and just sum it up. I mean, essentially, it was the Conservative Party, pretty much around Reagan, the Reagan administration, really realized that it would be the reproductive health access and abortion itself would be a great way to divide voters. And it worked. It can be, especially in the way it's presented, which is most oftentimes incorrect. It can be highly divisive, and it can really send people to the polls. And we've seen that in election after election after election after election. And then people find themselves you see more of this concept of like single issue voters, particularly around the issue of abortion. So, it is it is at its core a healthcare issue, and it is something that didn't just come about because of politics. It's been there, I mean, for as long as people have been able to get pregnant, right? Because not every pregnancy is desired, not every pregnancy is intended, and not every pregnancy is in an individual's reproductive life plan. And people have found ways to not continue a pregnancy. And it wasn't until, I would say this century where people have figured out, ways to have safe abortions, which typically started with aspiration abortion. But, before antibiotics, that didn't really come in proper sanitation techniques, that didn't come without risks in itself, and especially with regards to infection. And so, but over time we have realized, and we have just with any medical procedure, how exactly to make it safe. And as a result, it has become hands down one of the safest medical procedures that we can perform today. Which a lot of people just don't know. They think that it's very high risk. They think that it's, like medically like a huge liability, when really it's not. And in fact, continuing a pregnancy to term and delivering carries far greater risk to the patient than abortion does. So the political narrative around it is it's false, and it highlights all the wrong things about abortion. And so I'm hoping to fix some of that in this conversation tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That's definitely something that I think was convoluted for me, particularly around like, does abortion cause infertility and such things. So I'm so glad that I got to that clarified just now. And also when I was reading this book, it's such an important point. Your book also accomplishes a difficult task, humanizing and diversifying the picture of a typical abortion patient. I've heard comments about people who have abortions that disparage those individuals, unfortunately, as callous or thoughtless. And then I've also heard, quote, "It must have been such a difficult decision." And honestly, neither of those feel like they accurately reflect the decision-making process for so many people. And so I really appreciated this diversity of perspectives that's just throughout your book. And I also love how you open with a story of the not so stranger that you meet in a Target who discloses to you that she's had that abortion and never told anyone. And as you reference in your book, 1 in 4 women have had an abortion, yet in a 2015 study, it was reported that only 4 in 10 people who had had an abortion told someone about it. Mm-hmm. So I just think it's so meaningful to have your experiences, as well as the open, honest reflections of those in your book, to help shift this culture of silencing abortion, as you say. There's so much to draw from in each of these 17 folks' stories. I would really love to hear which story in the book resonates most with each of you. Pooja, do you want to take this first?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for putting this event together, Veda and the Sakhi team, and to all the folks that are here speaking today. I think for me, Maya's story definitely resonated the most, because Maya has a similar background to me. She's a South Asian female growing up in the States, growing up in the Northeast, a child of immigrants like I am. And just learning what it means to navigate bodily autonomy, what it means to navigate decision making while navigating the cultural norms, and how she grew up in those cultural norms, and being in between, two cultures. And I feel like that's often the narrative with most South Asian, youth growing up in the States. We're learning how to balance the two cultures. Actually, her story resonates a lot with mine in terms of like my own abortion story, right? Where experiences of a lot of South Asian women, love and sex are strongly linked to marriage, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? So premarital sex and just sexual pleasure are frowned upon, right? In my own particular story, unlike Maya's, I was with a loving partner, right? Who happens to be my husband. We knew we couldn't have a child because, well, I'm South Asian. Having a child, out of wedlock is highly frowned upon and unaccepted. So I knew I didn't have a choice, right? As much as most people think that there is a very clear choice, there often isn't, right? We sometimes are forced to make a decision that we don't want to make because we are inclusive of so many others' opinions in the choice, right? Maya speaks to feeling alone, right? Which is also a story a narrative that I hear from a lot of the survivors that I work with in this experience, right? What it feels to be alone and going to the procedure and then coming out and then not being able to share that experience, right? She speaks about how her mother has had a similar experience and she would actually understand, but she can't tell her mother because it would be frowned upon, right? Or she would be isolated and shamed by the family. And that can lead to a lot of internalized shame. So yeah, Maya's story definitely resonated a lot with me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's a really good point you make about like, where does that decision come from? Like what factors are influencing that? Because it doesn't necessarily just exist in a vacuum. And for some people, it's really easy to make that decision. And for some people, it's not. And thank you so much also for sharing from your own perspective. Just want to honor that as well. Nabila, is there one story in particular that was meaningful to you that you'd like to speak to?
Yeah, and also just to echo Pooja, again, thank you, Veda, thank you, Sakhi team, thank you, Dr. Shah, and everyone for making this possible tonight. Super honored, super grateful to be here. In terms of the story, so there's like 17 stories, right? And I think one thing I want to state is that, first of all, I love the poeticness behind how Dr. Shah, the way that you just kind of weaved every single story together, right? It's expansive, it's intersectional, it just is inclusive, and I was just completely blown away. So this is just a plug for anyone and everyone joining. Definitely get the book if you have it. Because I think the way that the stories have been shared, it kind of gives you a sense of what these folks are feeling. And the one story that resonated with me a lot, and I think the reason why it resonated with me is, I mean, very clearly because of the identities, and it was Noor's story. The way that, first of all, her background, she's like of Bangladeshi descent. I'm Bangladeshi. She talked about being Muslim, and the way she talked about being Muslim was also fascinating because that was also kind of the way that I kind of, practice being Muslim, which is, not super religious, but like religious in some ways, and her upbringing, and also her relationship with her older sister. I don't have an older sister, I am the older sister, but it was very interesting to kind of see the way that she navigated not only her identity in terms of being an immigrant, right, and being the child of immigrants, but also thinking about her relationship with herself and her relationship with her partner, and the way that she navigated abortion. And the theme I think that really struck me was the way that she wanted support, and how she came to this idea of she wanted support from her partner and the partner was not able to give it to her. And I think that's just super reflective of the way that we talk about abortion nowadays, which is we maybe don't talk about it, or it's shamed, or it's stigmatized. And I just thought it was beautiful the way that, Dr. Shah, the way that you kind of shared that piece of that story of Noor. And also just like the intersection of faith with abortion, right? Like I think being someone that works with Heart, which is a faith-inspired organization, oftentimes what we see with our clients, or oftentimes what we see with our communities, is this strong emphasis on how faith and religion really kind of dictates or has someone make the decision of whether or not they want to have an abortion. And so I thought it was actually beautiful that with Noor, she said that that wasn't something that was integral to her decision making. And I think that's super, super important, right? Because Muslims are not a monolith. And I think that was very important because that's also something that we interact with, is Muslims practice the faith in various ways. And sometimes they are using the faith as a way to make a decision or not. And so, I mean, I personally have not experienced abortion or pregnancy loss. However, with that being said, I've had many friends go through that. And so I think it was just beautiful to read Noor's story, but also just everyone's story in this book, and to see kind of how support or lack of support or compassion or just the interaction with the system kind of surfaced for each one and how they were all super interlaced.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think definitely it's really almost like a cathartic experience to read this book and have that ability to kind of just find pieces of yourself in each of these stories. It's just like such a beautiful thing that we're able to do as a result of this book. And definitely, I mean, the idea of like religion dictating faith or not, I'm not even a deeply religious person, and I would still say that influences of the concept of karma totally interact with how I conduct myself and subconsciously or consciously and use my body. So thank you for sharing that, definitely. Meera, is there any story in particular that you would like to speak to?
Yeah, and I just want to say, I just really love the way that you all both talked about Maya and Noor, because I will say, as a South Asian, like I was really drawn to those as well. I will say across the board, every single person I interviewed for this book, I just had so much fun. I mean, I laughed, I cried, I was like, whoa. And I mean, I felt like I had made a connection with each one. And just because, I mean, we're all human, right? And so there was something that I felt like I could really have this connection over, regardless of our backgrounds and regardless of how we identified, which was such a powerful experience for me personally. You talk about religion, and I find that to be, well, what I know is that the anti-abortion movement has really co-opted religion as their own. And I think that it's not fair at all. And because it's like, well, if we're Christian and we don't believe in abortion, well, that's not actually true. What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a Muslim? Like, there's different sects, there's different variations of it, right? Like, I identify as Jain, but am I like a devout religious Jain, right? Like, no. Do I practice Baryushan? No. Do I fast? No. But that doesn't mean I'm less Jain than somebody else, right? And like, does it mean that I have to adhere to all the principles of Jainism? No, right? Like, I eat onions, right? But I eat root vegetables, but I still think that I'm Jain, and I really relate to the concepts of, of non-absolutism and nonviolence, and because I think that those are so beautiful. And so I found some of the threads of religion in the various stories, things that I really connected with. And one of the stories that it didn't really dominate a whole chapter, but it was integrated in the Noor chapter. And it was this one woman who I saw as a patient who shared with me. Now, I just want to provide the caveat that I never ask a patient like why they're having an abortion, because I don't need to know that. I trust that they know what they're doing. I trust that they're coming to me for care that they need, and that's all I need to know. But I am at the privilege of getting to know more about my patients, and they share things with me because we establish a rapport and they feel comfortable. And this one patient said to me, I'm going to marry, my fiance and I are getting married in several months, but I just found out I was pregnant. And my imam told me that, I can't have an abortion because, it's before 6 weeks. I forget the how far she was, but it was like, okay. And she was like, I really do want to be a mom and I do really want to parent. I just can't do it right now. And she actually said it in front of the nurse, who maybe was not familiar with that or familiar with that the culture, the religion, whatnot. And she looked at me, and then later on she was sort of like, well, that sucks. That's not fair. She wanted to have that. She wanted to continue with the pregnancy, but that doesn't make sense that her religion told her not that her culture is telling her that, she can't, because her, the families would disown them. Right. But then the religion said that like it was okay. And I found myself getting defensive of her. Well, because I get that culture. Like, I get what that is, whether it's right or wrong or a mix of both. Like, I understand what it would mean for her to go back to her family pregnant and not married, right? Like, I'm, again, not saying it's right or wrong, just saying that that's her reality and that is her lived experience. And I just felt like, even though I've never had to go through that, I felt like I could connect with that in a way that so I explained that. I had like a really long conversation with that nurse afterwards. And, she, if anything, she was being protective of the patient. She wasn't being judgmental. She was just like, I don't understand. Like, she wants to have the pregnancy, but her parents would disown her, but then the religion's saying yes. And so anyway, it was a moment of just further understanding of the human experience and the varied experiences that our patients come to our health centers with. And it was really amazing. And so I felt like that happened throughout every single story. But that one in particular really struck me. And I think about often.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I I would say definitely, I think it illuminates how there's such a struggle to maintain autonomy over our own body and the decisions we make with our body. And also resonates just working at Sakhi as an organization that's like trying to create cross-cultural messaging and is constantly in the business of translating in so many different ways. So that really does resonate, and thank you again for sharing that. I also wanted to ask you about Alex's story, because your book does the work of demonstrating through storytelling how abortion is an issue for people of all genders. So for context for the audience, in Alex's story, you mentioned your colleague, a trans man named Chance Krupansky, who is a family nurse practitioner at a health center in New York. He stresses the importance of using inclusive, non-gendered phrases such as people who are pregnant, or people who menstruate, or people who have a uterus. And as you say, language is a real barrier to care for gender expansive people. So I'm just wondering, in addition to using non-gendered language, what are some policy and practical changes that you would like to see realized that would support TGNC folks' access to safe and affirming reproductive health care?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And actually a couple of my calls today at work were involved around that same idea, that how do we create a safer space even at Planned Parenthood, which is known to be a safe space, right? But it's historically been known as a health center for women to receive care, right? And in my own Planned Parenthoods, I've really changed that. I myself don't say like women's health, women's reproductive health. I say, it is reproductive health and it's an all gender issue. And, I will say 1 in 4 women has an abortion in her lifetime, but that's because that's the way that the data was gathered. So I can't really misconstrue the data. But in general, like even just putting your pronouns by your name, I think is huge. It's a huge signal to the person that you're talking to that says like, you know what, like I get it. And I honor this whole concept of pronouns. Like it helps you identify me and it'll help me identify you, and use the right pronouns. And I've been told by many patients that that's really important. And so we ask all of our patients their pronouns, and we document it in the EMR. We ask them what name they use. And the example that I give is that it's not just a trans non-binary issue. I always say that, my dad is a cis man, right, from India, and his name is Jugal Kishore. Like no one can say that. So when he says his name, he always simplifies it to J, and he actually prefers being called J, right? So so it's for everybody. Like, what do you like to go by? What do you go by? And so we ask everybody what their name is, what their preferred name is. We're really trying to also stay away from preference, because it's not a preference, it's just what you use. Really thinking about, especially when it comes to sex, talking about like the behaviors and not necessarily like the sexual orientation. Because we talk about sexual orientation from a public health perspective to like honor identities, but from a healthcare perspective, it doesn't tell you much. We really want to know what behaviors, what body parts are you using for sex, and what behaviors you're engaging in, because that's going to tell me ultimately what you're at risk for, what sexually transmitted infections you're at risk for, if you're at risk for unintended pregnancy. So language is so important. It's huge. It dictates so much of what we do in sexual and reproductive healthcare. And if you're open-minded and you ask open-ended questions, you're going to get more of the information that you need, and you're going to gain more trust over time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Also, you can see the binary kind of coming out there when we say things like, what's your orientation? And it's interesting how that kind of it can have an adverse effect of, now you don't know the complete story. You don't necessarily know the risks, because our lives are much more than binaries. They live and exist on spectrum. So that's such an interesting perspective, for sure. I also, speaking of, on the topic of gender, I found myself sympathizing with Mateo's story as well, which is the story of a man whose partner had an abortion. As you comment in that story, Meera, while men have the privilege of being able to see and experience reproductive health and autonomy through a different lens, we also perpetuate that privilege by not making men part of the conversation, which is unfair to them as well as women and those with the uterus. Nabila as an educator, Pooja as a clinician, Dr. Shah as a doctor, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Beyond allyship, how do you engage men in your work? Nabila, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, sure. I feel like this is such a great question. Also a really hard one, right? Because I think this comes up often and it's always trying to find the fine line of like, how do we include men, right? If we're really thinking about the binary. And I want to say that one of the hardest aspects of pulling men into the conversation is that they're already socially programmed to individually activate a response instead of listening, right? And a lot of times they can't even hear beyond like this readiness to respond. That's basically inhibiting them of the capacity to deconstruct themselves, to be vulnerable enough to even hear someone else, right? So like that's one thing that we're working with when we're thinking about having and including men into the conversation. Secondly, where men are actually engaged, right? It tends to happen because they are self-aware enough to even think about the political shifts, to be able to have the sensitivity to address this topic, right? Or whether it's like the topic of not just like reproductive health, but also for thinking about gender-based violence, right? Because sometimes there's like that intersection of violence happening, as well as the not having access to the understanding of what reproductive rights are to an individual. And so with that being said, I mean, one of my questions is like, do we want men to be involved or do we want certain men to be involved, right? Because I think that's a very important distinction to make, because if we think about like socially right now, or like, you know, in the political sphere, who is talking? Who is talking for those that are actually the most marginalized when it comes to accessing reproductive health or like reproductive rights? And then also further, do we use the metric to involve men that perpetuates the same cycles of violence that we're seeking to disrupt? And how are we going to liberate ourselves from that too, right? So like, how are we actually projecting and enabling that type of behavior where that cycle of violence is going to continue? Because we're also not thinking about what kind of men we're having involved in these conversations and what allyship means. But also, do we want an ally or do we want a co-conspirator? Do we want someone to kind of take the, like be at the forefront of all of this, or are we asking them to like kind of be on the sidelines and be supportive, right? So like really thinking about how are we, again, it goes back to language matters, and thinking about how men are showing up, we also have to ask these questions, right? Because if we're only hearing men of certain backgrounds because they have, for example, economic and institutional foundation to do things like, oh, like have a TED Talk, and they have like a massive Instagram or social media following, right? They're writing essays and like Huffington Post, and they're making decisions and policies, right? Rather than getting their hands dirty and doing the work themselves, right? Like you want to be on the ground and do the work, you're going to have to get your hands dirty. And so how are we also thinking about like the classism behind who speaks, who we're inviting to the table, and also why is there a table to begin with? So that's kind of, I feel like that's a long-winded answer to the question, but I think there's different unique ways that you can incorporate men into the conversation, and it really needs us investigating and interrogating how maybe we're perpetuating perhaps misogyny if we're not really thinking about dismantling a lot of these things that uphold violence and also limit access to things like reproductive health rights.
That was amazing. That was so great. And I have so many things I want to like to add to that, if it's okay.
Do it. The virtual floor is yours.
Cis white men have historically been the oppressors in this movement. I mean, it's just fact. I didn't make that up. I didn't invent that. Like it's the truth. And they've been the lawmakers, the politicians who have like spearheaded a lot of the anti-abortion movement, and for their own political gain, right? And so when it comes to like involving men, and when I say men, I mean cis men, it's not about like saying, oh yeah, it's their right to have a say, because the right is always going to be in the hands of the one who has the uterus and who's carrying the pregnancy. And that's just the law, right? It's the one. So the right to access abortion is the one who's carrying the pregnancy. Period. Now, I don't like to use allyship. I like to use, I like how you say co-conspirator. I think that's so great. But I also think like they are beneficiaries, right? Like, and I don't think that they view it that way. Like it's always this like, it's the issue for like a woman. I would never dare say anything because that's her issue. Well, no, because you're benefiting as well. And let's talk about the ways in which you benefit. And there's actually a lot of research around there to show that, like, people are more likely to like finish college. People are more likely to go to college, right? If like they've been with a partner who's had an abortion. So there's a lot of that's just like not really recognized and not really talked about. So I do think like, and it's interesting because with the Mateo chapter, I know I was taking a risk, but I felt like it was so important to me, and I just like went with it. I rewrote that chapter like 50 times because it was so hard. Because I don't like to silo this as a women's health issue. It's an all gender issue. And I just think historically we have done that. And how do we make it so that like cis men are offended by the headlines that say like, oh, abortion is banned in South Carolina now at 6 weeks, which just happened the other day, right? Like that triggered me. But why isn't it triggering like, you know, my male friends? I mean, I would say my male friends get upset by it because it's sort of the bubble that I surround myself in. But you know, if that makes sense, like I just feel like it's because we know what that means and we've thought about it critically, or we've personally been affected by it, or we know somebody who's had an abortion, or we can think through what that would be like. And so it's just figuring out ways in which we can empower men to recognize the importance and the value in protecting access to abortion, because it's legal in all 50 states. And ultimately the right is of the person carrying the pregnancy. But how do we get more cis men invested in protecting access to it is I don't know. I mean, that's a whole nother sort of narrative that I want to get into. And so I really love the way that you framed it. Yeah, I really do.
Thank you both for sharing that. For some reason, as you were both speaking, the word bystander kept coming into mind, right? And it's a word that I'm kind of trying to love and appreciate recently, because one of the first people that I've told about what I went through was my brother, right? Because he's another South Asian male and a child of immigrants who would kind of like, be able to understand how I feel, right? I think involving cisgender males as bystanders, and as bystanders who are educated and then trained to be able to support their partners, right? Their cisgender heterosexual female partners, or non-binary partners in the matter, right? And being able to, Mateo puts it very nicely, right? Like, we recognize that they are the problem, yet we continue to perpetuate the problem, and and that cycle, right? So do we provide allyship, right? How do we recognize them as allies? What kind of messages do we send to them that they are allies, right? And their voice does matter, right? I think about Sakhi, I work with majority of the population I work with are cisgender heterosexual women, right? So my view of what a survivor looks like is very narrow and very limited. And I recognize that, right? But I also recognize that survivors are not just cisgender heterosexual females, right? There are male survivors, there are folks from the LGBTQI community, right? But I'm not able to be their voice, right? There's something that's lacking probably within me, right? As a cisgender heterosexual female, right? So it also requires a lot of interpersonal reflection, right? On what messages am I sending to these folks, right? And how do I actually change, right? To be more inclusive, right? And to not continue to perpetuate that, cycle that continues to exist.
Yeah. That's really great that you just took a moment to say, what can I do to stop perpetuating this cycle? I think that's a super important point in all of this. And to be honest, I've never heard that being brought up in the context of this particular narrative around incorporating more cis men in the conversation. So I like that.
Yeah, Pooja, another thing that you said, thinking about cycles is something that kind of resonated with me as well as we think about our work at Sakhi. If we don't engage, people other than people who identify as women, we're just managing a crisis rather than ending and addressing causes. And I think we could say the same thing here, where we're kind of managing our own opinions, and it stays in bubbles. Rather, we end up just kind of siloing ourselves in the need for access in these conversations. So I think when we engage men, particularly with people that we trust, like the conversation that you had with your brother, I don't want to assume anything about their relationship, but to me that resonates as quite brave. That would be something that would be very difficult for me, to have a conversation with someone who wasn't my partner, who identifies as a cis male like this. And so I so appreciate that, because I think interpersonal conversations are really a huge part normalizing abortion and shifting the culture here. And Nabila, what you said about co-conspirators, that really resonates deeply. A dear colleague of mine at Sakhi introduced me to that term when I started, however long ago, and it sticks with me in my brain. Just like, you're not in it on the sidelines, so who said we're in it together. Like we have to shift the narrative about who is affected by these things, whether it's gender-based violence, sexual violence, or abortion. They're where it's the case of beneficiaries. To your point, Meera. So again, especially thinking about relationships here, this conversation about abortion really opens up a dialogue regarding our stories and needs around reproductive health care, and demonstrates that role that relationship building plays in realizing and expanding our reproductive rights. Complications, costs, wait times are all barriers to entry. I see this as a form of government sanctioned systemic trauma, both physical and emotional, to patients and potential patients, because reproductive healthcare simply is not accessible to all. Pooja, I'd love to hear from you. How do you see this deficit of reproductive care and access come up at Sakhi?
Thanks, Veda. It comes up in a few ways. So in addition to being like the associate director, I also provide counseling, like mental health services for a few of the survivors that we provide services for. So it comes up in various ways, right? If there's like lack of physical access to reproductive care, right, Veda? So like lack of facilities and medical care, or not being able to get to that facility, right? Because the facility is maybe like 10 miles or 15 miles from their home. And this is a new immigrant that doesn't know how to navigate the subway system, or doesn't have money for an Uber or a cab, right? And then there's the lack of autonomy in decision making, right? A lot of South Asian women aren't given the autonomy to make their own decisions, right? Like from the very beginning, we're given the message that like, we don't own our bodies and we don't own the right to make decisions for our bodies, right? At first, it's decisions that are made by our parents, right? I encourage folks to think about some of the messages you received when, like you got your first period, right? Like Dr. Shah mentions it very beautifully in her book, and I had a similar experience. And then, after marriage, it's a decision that like your husbands make, right? So they might navigate like what it means for you to access contraceptive, care, or if you want children or not, right? Or what contraceptive care you're using, right? And Dr. Shah again mentions this. And then there's a lack of education, right? There's a lack of shared information within the community due to the stigma, right? Due to the shame that's associated with. And then there's controlled access, right? Dr. Shah in the book mentions the word or the phrase reproductive coercion, right? So if your partner is, limiting the amount of, access you have to contraceptives or the type of contraceptives you can use, right? Or if you can and cannot have kids, right? That's all reproductive coercion, right? And this is something that a lot of survivors do experience. And then if let's say that they do have access to abortion care and health care and reproductive healthcare, services, there is great isolation around that, right? So not having access to, if they choose to, emotional and mental health afterwards, right? So I think about a lot of the women who have suffered in isolation, like Maya, like her mother, who wasn't able to, speak to their experience because of what the society or what community might say, right? Oh, I can maybe speak to this friend about it, but maybe I don't want to trigger something within her, but maybe she'll feel this particular way if I discuss this. Maybe there will be judgment. Will I be seen as a loose woman? Will this hurt my, my dating prospects or my marital prospects, right? There is so much, like, you know, that adds to the lack of access, right? It could be physical, it could be medical, it could be emotional and psychological. And I think it's important for us to kind of note all of that, right? Because it's not black or white, right? It's not whether I have access to contraceptive or abortion care and not.
I love that point, Pooja, that it's not just physical and tangible, it's also emotional, psychological, et cetera. And as you say, it can be done through, that can happen through isolation or a lack of autonomy or feelings of what will they say because of the and shame that unfortunately surround this topic. Definitely. And I appreciate you sharing that perspective. Nabila, given the barriers to entry for professional care, I just wonder, especially considering your work at Heart, what kinds of community practices do you see as a model for promoting reproductive care, education, to Pooja's point, and well-being?
Yeah, and like everything to what Pooja said, right, in terms of like the limits, right, to reproductive care and like the access. So Heart, we're not a direct service organization. We're much more based, like we do a lot of macro level work, right? So we're doing a lot of education, we're doing trainings, we're doing research, we're also doing advocacy. And so in terms of really thinking about how do we do this in terms of community practices, like one of the first things that come to mind, and it's also to Pooja's point, which is the education piece, right? We have to normalize abortion. We have to normalize that these are things that happen. And also to just Dr. Shah's point, where it's not that high risk, right? Like if we're going to look at abortion and think about how it's been stigmatized, like why? Like what is the root of that? So a lot of Heart's work is like thinking about what are the root causes of violence, what are barriers to disclosure, right? Because we do a lot of gender-based violence work, specifically sexual violence, and really thinking about what are the things actually preventing folks from, folks from disclosing or even reporting, right? And something that we do is we actually have a few frameworks that we work through. And the first one is our Rahmah Principles, which is a way that we respond to survivors, right? And I know that's very specific to gender-based violence, but the reason I bring this up is Rahmah is an Arabic word for compassion. And the root word of Rahmah is Raham, which is womb. And I think it's fascinating. And I want to kind of bring that in because we're talking about abortion, but one of our biggest things is when we're doing our community education piece, right? Working with community leaders, working with mainstream organizations, we're trying to figure out, well, how do we go back to building compassion? How do we have this conversation where community leaders can hold space for those that are going through this? And how do we not use this Western savior lens, specifically if we're talking about abortion or pregnancy loss or what have you, right, in the patient room, right? Because what we essentially want is a non-judgmental space for folks to practice their values. And that essentially, like if you think about like a public health model, that's very much a part of clinical care. So how do we reintegrate that language? How do we reintegrate all those things, right? Because if we can plug into this in terms of like the full spectrum of experiences of, if you want to say like reproductive suppression or oppression, right, towards like a cultivation away from bodily harm in all gender and sexual expressions, we have to start from an education, uprooting the hierarchy, right, of white settler patriarchy, which gives agency to misogyny. And that's how we continue to like project violence and enable violence. So with Heart, we're starting from the pedagogy of Rahmah, right? Like starting from the basis and the foundation of compassion. And then we're trying to empower collectivity in our community's pursuit of gender justice. Like that's the only way that we can do this. And if we're thinking about community care in its most simplest form, it's things like, you know, depending on what stage of care you need based on the procedure that you're going through, simple things like bringing food and helping and supporting. And if, you know, to Pooja's point in terms of like the support and care, and to Dr. Shah's point in terms of beneficiaries, like who's showing up and how can they show up and how do we create that environment and how do we enforce our communities to make this something that's important and integral in terms of sexual health education and reproductive health education, even within their own community spaces. So those are some of the ways that I can foresee this happening in terms of thinking about, you know, best practices for community.
Absolutely. And I think in general, there are a lot of ties between this conversation about reproductive health and gender-based violence. So it makes sense that you know, it comes from that lens as well. They're intersecting issues. And I think that's for many reasons, you know, some that include what Pooja mentioned earlier, and all of you actually mentioned earlier, about autonomy over our own bodies and agency, in particular self-determination, the ability for us to make our own decisions about ourselves, our emotional states, our mental states, our bodily states, etc., and to pursue our own happiness, whatever that means to us. I think there's so many ties there. So I'm really glad that you kind of brought that out. I also would say I love this pedagogy of Rahmah. That's something I've never heard of, and I would love to learn more outside of here. But the way that you speak about community care in general reminds me of a concept that's somewhat new to me, that I'm not going to go into deep detail about, but just want to mention, which is pod mapping, which is essentially a way to kind of crisis plan and create a network for folks who are have a predilection to perhaps experiencing a mental health crisis. So again, another intersection here, right? We have the intersection of reproductive care, we have the and healthcare in general, the intersection of gender-based violence, the intersection of mental health, all of them coming together, talking about intersectionality. From there, I also, again, on the theme of relationship building, to each of you, Meera, perhaps you would like to address this question first. How do each of you think providers and institutions in particular can work with organizations like Sakhi and Heart to normalize abortion?
Providers in healthcare organizations, or you mean, well,
yes.
I mean, I think first of all, establishing these relationships is incredibly important. You know, I reached out to Sakhi a while back. I actually attended an event because I follow Sakhi on Instagram. So it was like 2 summers ago. And it was one about survivors telling their stories. And I feel like I'm in my own little bubble of healthcare and reproductive health. And I really wanted to connect to an organization where I felt like there could potentially be some overlap. And this was like way before it was sort of writing the book, but didn't have an editor, didn't have a publisher yet. So it had nothing to do really with that, but it was just me wanting to think more broadly about the intersections that come into play with reproductive health, because it in itself isn't, you know, like reproductive justice is a social justice, is a racial justice, is an economic justice issue, right? They're all interlinked. And so, you know, I went to this event and I was blown away. And I think partnering with organizations who are doing the work and doing similar work is super important to me, personally and professionally. I am of South Asian descent, and the work that Sakhi does is geared towards the South Asian community, and that's super important. And I think just being aligned in our goals and our mission and the way in which we approach these issues. So, you know, something that Planned Parenthood has made a priority is training providers in trauma-informed care, which aligns with, you know, the work that Sakhi does, right? Whereas, you know, and then, you know, working, and one of the things I know that, you know, you all have reached out to me about linking your clients to accessing sexual and reproductive health care, or even basic questions about, for example, herpes, right? Like I, you know, helped facilitate that. So, you know, just working together more and recognizing that we're all kind of geared towards kind of shared goals is really important.
Definitely working towards shared goals. Because they're overlapping identities, overlapping forms of oppression we're all pushing back on. Absolutely.
Yep.
Nabila or Pooja, do either of you want to respond to that question?
Sure. I've referred clients to Dr. Shah in the past, so I appreciate her existing and being able to provide like that cultural, humble lens to services, right? And I think like connections like that, right? Like we talk about how, you know, women of color and women from lower socioeconomic, you know, classes might not have access to reproductive care and abortion care as readily available as other folks. Right. So and those are sort of the folks that we see here at Sakhi, right? So making sure that their accessibility to services is easier than it would be if they weren't linked to us, right? And especially for survivors of gender-based violence, right? When that access is even greatly limited, right? And then I think about education, right? Like having platforms such as this to be able to connect with folks that are out there, right? To kind of shed a light on what this issue actually is versus what the messages that we're fed every day, right? It's not so black and white, right? There are so many colors of the rainbow in there, right? And all sorts of shades. And then like being able to support each other in the work, right? So if Dr. Shah is doing sort of the medical work, right? Like maybe the counselors come in to provide that, like, you know, that mental health care that might be needed after, right? And then Nabila comes in there to do some of this preventive, like sort of educational work that's needed, right? Like how do we support each other and lift each other's missions up, like you said, Veda, like, because they're all aligned, it's all on the same spectrum, right? But sometimes we function in silos, but really to be able to break those silos and to be able to find intersectionality and to be able to support each other's missions.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we put this panel together with that view in mind of let's get these three spaces all together because they're overlapping, but like you said, sometimes we're siloed from one another. So again, it's just so wonderful to be in conversation with all of you. Nabila, do you want to share some thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, right? But I think the one thing that's coming to mind is Audre Lorde's "There's no such thing as a single issue" struggle, right? And so I think
It's
that's
the
coming
opening
up.
quote in my book.
Yeah, exactly. It's right there in the beginning of the book. Again, everyone get the book. Another plug, because it's fantastic. Like Meera definitely does such a fantastic job of kind of interlacing all of these things, all these concepts. But one thing that's striking is the values alignment piece, right? Like I think we have to be committed to being values aligned, right? Whether we're doing this interdisciplinary stuff, right? To compromise and then to be complicit can cause more harm. And the most marginalized in our communities are already experiencing harm, whether it's through the communities, whether it's through their intimate partners, but also through the state. So depending on like who they are and what they're bringing to the table in terms of their identity, like there's violence happening, there's harm happening all the time. And so it's really committing to that values alignment piece that we're not going to compromise on that and allow ourselves to be in community with everyone in all these different professional spaces, because we know that they're trauma informed. We know that they're anti-racist, right? And not just like in terms of words, but like internally as an organization, they're doing the work to also be anti-racist. So really looking at, well, what does equity look like on their board, on their, like, who are their employees? Like what's actually happening? Like, do the employees get benefits? Like what does burnout look like? Is there high turnover? I know this might seem like it has nothing to do with this conversation, but it does, right? Because the way internal organizational culture is happening will also kind of inform the way that they're working with clients, with community. And so really being intentional about who are we working with and who do we want to bring to communities, especially if communities don't have access to anything. And there's like language barriers, there's cultural barriers. So really being informed about how we're connected and why we're trying to be connected to do this work and to make it sustainable, like I think that's really important. So want to continue to harp on Meera's point of being values aligned, because I think that's truly important for us to do, period.
Absolutely. And I think we're always learning from each other. And what you said also about the internal culture, I think it's totally relevant, right? Like Tima Kun comes to mind and thinking about the fact that we don't want to be recreating white supremacy culture within our institutions and organizations and in our partnerships. We want to be more expansive than that in so many different ways. And more acknowledge each other's identities and the multitudes of them rather than just recreating the kind of toxic wheel that we have out there. So I really appreciate that point. I have one more closing question, especially as I'm looking at the time for all of you, which is, I wonder what your hope is for those in attendance today. What is the message that you want people to walk away from this conversation with? Pooja, do you want to, whoever, go for it.
No, I just hope that people walk away from this conversation realizing that abortion is normal, abortion is common, and abortion is healthcare. that there is no typical abortion patient, that they represent every single socioeconomic background, racial identity, ethnic makeup. Like, they are most likely somebody you know, somebody you love. That it's an incredibly common human experience. And South Asian people have abortions too, believe it or not. I love the story about one of my health centers in Long Island where I work. There's a large population of Gujarati speaking people around there, and they just started with one patient learning about me and coming to see me. And then, I gave her my card, and then my card got passed around. And now I see this kind of steady flow of South Asian patients for sexual and reproductive health care. And every time I would tell my mom, like, oh my gosh, Mom, I saw somebody else who's Gujarati speaking, and I put in an IUD, and I did it all in Gujarati, or I, did an abortion, did it all in Gujarati. And, in the beginning I would text my mom and say, how do you say uterus again? And, she would quit, or I'd call her in the next room and be like, wait, what's the best word for birth control? Should I just say family planning? And, afterwards she started to talk about it more, because she realized her people have abortions, right? She was able to make that personal, even though she had never met any of my patients. Just the fact that I said that I spoke to them in Gujarati, and, one of the patients I cared for was from Baroda, which is where she's from. And she was just so tickled by that. And she was like, oh, wow. She could say yes, everybody has, every demographic, every group has, experiences, can say that they're familiar with abortion or have had an abortion or whatnot. But for her to really feel that made a difference. And so I truly believe in the power of storytelling, and that it's what's ultimately going to change hearts and minds. And so while, I don't think it's a requirement to share your abortion story, but I do think that I do hope that we can get to a place in our culture and our society where it is something that you can just casually talk about if you choose to, and not be met with stigma and shame and all the bad stuff, right? And that it's celebrated in the same way that we celebrate continuing a pregnancy. So that's my hope and desire, that we get to that place.
Yes, you made a decision for yourself and you were able to honor and uphold it. Go you, go us, definitely. Yeah. Nabila or Pooja, do either of you want to share your message?
Yeah.
Sure. Is it okay if I go first, Nabila?
Yeah, go ahead.
I couldn't tell. Dr. Shah, I had the same experience when it comes to mental health with my mom, so that resonated a lot with me. I think from this event, I really want folks to think more widely about reproductive rights and abortion care than what is painted by the media, right? It's not a conservative versus liberal issue, or pro-choice versus pro-life issues, right? There are greater aspects to it. Folks should have the autonomy to make decisions for themselves. And this includes decisions regarding sexual pleasure, consent, access to reproductive rights, and abortion care, right? And really for folks to create safe spaces to be able to have that discussion, right? One of the reasons why I discussed my story today was to decrease the stigma that's surrounded, right? Dr. Shah mentioned, someone who's seeking abortion care, right, doesn't look the same as a second person seeking abortion care, right? There is a range of folks that seek abortion care, right? And for us to normalize that, and for us to provide safe spaces or for them to have discussions, right? Because it is something that they, chose. And like we said, to celebrate it, right? To be able to be in spaces where that's celebrated. And if they need support around it, to be able to support them, right? So really, for those that are listening who have, or watching or tuned in, who have experienced, similar narratives, I hope this provides a lot of comfort and allows you to resonate and allows you to feel less isolated. And for those that are tuning in that have never experienced this, I really hope it provides you with the space to be able to support someone who possibly has, or to be able to create safe spaces in which you can discuss this.
Yeah, absolutely. Nabila, do you want to close us off?
I feel like there's so many messages, and Meera and Pooja did such a great job. I like don't even know what to say, but if I had to like share a message, right? Reproductive rights begins with an education that you have rights to begin with, first and foremost, and that you need to know what those rights are and how those rights cannot be detached from the right of your own personhood, right? Like who you are as a person. So these include your rights to guaranteed healthcare, the right to sexual pleasure. Can we talk about this? Because that's important. And I think that also gets kind of, brushed under the rug. And then to also not be targeted by the state in the pursuit of those rights. So essentially what I'm saying is get radical, get involved, get in the streets, but like be code friendly. Do everything that you can, right? And also I will end on this note, have relationship grace, right? I think we talked about a lot of things today, and you might be activated, you might be triggered, you might feel things, right? Whether you are directly impacted or not, have relationship grace. Because I think oftentimes in order for us to do this work, in order for us to have these conversations in our community, we need to think about sustainability. Burnout is real. So if you can't have that compassion for who you are and what you're bringing to wherever you are coexisting, it's going to be a problem. So I really do also want to stress this idea of relationship grace, not only with you and yourself, but also relationship grace with folks that you are also trying to do education with. But literally get involved, get radical, do all the things. We're here, reach out to us. Like Sakhi is amazing. Dr. Shah is phenomenal. And then there's Heart. So there's like access, like we're providing the access to all these different ways that you can get involved. And so just do it.
That's such a fantastic message. Thank you, Nabila. And to your point about sexual pleasure, absolutely. It's like you can't have an abortion without sex. And so last thing I just want to chime in quickly and say is also, you can find sexual liberation, and we can find sexual liberation outside of what the mainstream is telling us. We get to find the sexual liberation that we want, that feels good for us, that feels good for our bodies, and no one else gets to define that for us. But we can access it whenever we want. And we work towards a culture that builds safety around that as well. And so I just wanted to emphasize that. If you ever want to talk about something related to that, Sakhi is always here. Heart has so much information and resources around this to refer to. You can connect with Nabila and Pooja. Their emails will be shared in the chat if they haven't already. And looking at the time, we have about 15-ish minutes. So I want to turn to a Q&A as quickly as possible, knowing that there's so much to discuss on this topic. As I mentioned earlier, if you've not read Dr. Shah's book yet, here it is again. Which, by the way, I'm calling it a technical anthology. Hopefully Dr. Shah is okay with that. And I'm calling it that because of its exquisite combination of diverse storytelling and research. You can find that at the link in the chat, the book. There's a whole universe in this book that we've only begun to scratch the surface of tonight. So I hope each of you will have a chance to read it. So I am going to look out for Q&A questions. Okay, we have a question from someone who asks, is there a faith-based framework that you have seen that is pro-choice? It's a great question. Dr. Shah, do you want to take that? I'm definitely thinking of Hannah here.
Yeah, so I mean, there isn't one that has been formalized other than just the notion that, that faith doesn't exist in binaries, right? That faith, that I had this great professor when I was getting my MPH who the entire 1-hour class was just about, so what is religion? And she just kept pitching it to us. And we were all like raising our hands and giving our answers. And ultimately what we decided is it's what you decide that it is, right? Like, yes, there are these doctrines. Yes, there are these books. Yes, there's these scriptures, but then there's variation on variation on variation. And, and like I said earlier, you identifying as Muslim and practicing one aspect of it but not the other doesn't make you less Muslim, right? Like, you know, I still get to say that I'm Jane even though I eat root vegetables. Like, there's no God who's saying, no, you are less Jane because you don't do that. And so and that's essentially the spirit of choice, and it's the spirit of, you know, you get to identify how you want to identify. And in the same notion of bodily autonomy and choosing what you decide to do with your body, those all align, and there's a lot of overlap. And so, you know, what's really frustrating about the anti-abortion movement is that they've really taken on religion as like, well, God said this, well, God said that. Well, no, that's maybe your God who said that, but that's not everybody else's God, or that's not so-and-so's God and this person's God, right? So it's just the wrong way to look at it. And I think ultimately, you know, in theory, this country, you know, was created with the notion that there's a separation of church and state. We don't oftentimes see that, but that's truly in the foundation of the way that this country came to be, for that reason, that there has to be religious freedom. There has to be this idea that you can choose how you identify in the spectrum of faith. And so, you know, I'm not, again, I may identify as Jane, but I don't necessarily approach my work through the faith lens. But I have thought about it critically enough where I feel confident in what I'm saying. And so, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think one thing that I remember scribbling in the margins of the book is la cité, right, which is a French concept of secularity. And I heard recently, actually, I think it was on the Daily, this differentiation between American secularism and French secularism, where American secularism is freedom of religion, French secularism is freedom from religion. And so I'm not going to put an answer out here, but it just made me think, you know, how does one benefit abortion? How does one, or in some, you know, what are the pros and cons, you know, thinking about that in relation to abortion and healthcare in general, and how we kind of determine control of our own bodies. So yeah, definitely really appreciate that perspective. It's a very diverse, there's a diverse range of answers here.
And one thing I just wanted to add that, you know, that I think that we have to be very careful of is just acknowledging that you can be sure. If you're going to say that you were anti-abortion and you don't believe it, listen, that's fine. I'm not going to try and change your mind around that. However, you can't make policy based on that, right? There's a huge distinction there that we have to remember. And in the policies that I've seen be created time and time again in various state and local legislations, it's oftentimes rooted in this idea of morality, and yet there's that varies from person to person. So again, it's we celebrate people's varied beliefs, but we can't make policy around one individual belief.
Yes, I just want to repeat that, the idea that you can be pro-choice and anti-abortion. It's your personal belief versus what you're projecting on others and what you're subjecting others to. And I think that's a huge point, and I'm so glad that you brought it out. It's essential to this discussion. Does anybody else want to address this question before we move on to the next one?
I not necessarily address the question, but just, you know, faith is often brought up with the survivors we work with, right? And faith is, like Dr. Shah mentioned, like faith is used to intimidate folks into making certain decisions that might not benefit them or benefit someone else, right? What I've tried to do is not shy away from talking about faith. Right. And I think a lot of service providers do shy away from that. Right. And I can get in some trouble here, but like, I encourage folks to like actually sit down and read their holy books, right? Or read the scriptures that are written, right? Rather than being taught those scriptures by, cisgender males often, right? Because like what message is being sent to you, right? And what message is actually written, right? So to be able to make your own decisions based on the knowledge you have rather than the based decisions on the knowledge you're provided, right, from someone else. And I think that's really important. So when someone comes, as service providers out there, right, when someone tells you that you're not allowed to do this because such and such says that, right, like I really encourage you to actually read your scripture or read whatever information that they're providing and make that decision for yourself.
I love that. I love that. What's interesting, there's a lot of conversation around how religion can be so misogynistic and patriarchal, right? I'm actually getting married in August, and we're going to have a Hindu ceremony, but I'm trying to find a female pandit, and it's been impossible, but I'm determined. I think I may have a lead, but you know, that feels unique to us, and that feels right. But because there is a lot of like preconceived and sort of scripted ways of thinking about religion. So I really like that you're like, you know what, go back to it if that's important to you and sort of see what resonates with you and kind of rewrite the narrative, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. So with Heart, like I said earlier, like we're faith inspired. And so we're very much rooted in working, for example, in Muslim communities, for Muslims, by Muslims. And one of the things that we've seen come up often is us having to be very sensitive around faith and religion, especially as it's attached directly to reproductive health or reproductive rights. Because Pooja, to your point, like spiritual abuse is real. And it is something that oftentimes is like the direction folks take in terms of, okay, I need to make this decision. However, I have a very complicated relationship with religion. I also have a very complicated relationship with my community. So like, where do I go? How do I navigate this? So I also think that's beautiful, right? Is this idea of empowering someone to reframe their understanding of the faith and the way that they choose to practice to understand what decision that they need to make. And oftentimes what we've seen, or at least I'll speak from personal experience, is folks are just maybe making a decision that we might not really align with. However, again, if you do the work of gender-based violence, you know that you allow survivors, victims, thrivers to take the driver's seat. So we kind of just like follow their direction. And so it's really just kind of working with them and thinking about, well, what works for them at that moment? And what is the underlying education that we might need to do in terms of providing resources or connecting them to folks that can actually help them be more expansive with their thinking, and also, again, the reframing of how they're interacting with faith. But I really love you bringing up that point.
Yes, thank you to that person who asked that question. There's a question in here that's quite tough. I'm going to ask anyway because I think it's a great question. As was mentioned, so many women have abortions. I'll say lots, not everybody who has an abortion that identifies as a woman because of bad circumstances, culture, finance, family pressures, etc., as opposed to it really being their ideal choice. By accepting abortion, are we committing to these inequities remaining in place rather than fighting to eliminate them? I'll let you stew on that for a second.
Well, I think we need to start off by asking, or by, I guess, reestablishing this idea that we're not trying to minimize abortion. We're trying to acknowledge that it is a reality, and it is something that is normal, that it happens in our culture and our society, and it is a healthcare issue. So, you know, I think that once upon a time, Hillary Clinton said that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. And, you know, I look at that, I hear that, and I think, well, that's just like the wrong way to frame it, because you're inadvertently stigmatizing the issue by saying it should be rare, because then you're saying that it's a bad thing. What we should be doing is celebrating people's decisions about their body, regardless of whether it's to continue pregnancy, to not continue pregnancy, or to choose adoption. And all of these inequities regarding culture, cultural biases, you know, food scarcity, job insecurity, homelessness, like all of the social justice issues 100% play into people's abilities to make that choice. So yes, and this is what I was saying earlier, is that they're all intersectional, right? It's not just about this cis woman accessing abortion care. It's about this Black cis woman who has 3 children, has 2 jobs, who lives in a state where she's not even allowed to use her Medicaid because of the Hyde Amendment. So she has to pay out of pocket. Oh, but she also has to wait 72 hours between being diagnosed as pregnant and getting her abortion. So she means she has to take 2 days off of work and consider childcare, right? All of that are just highlighting all of the inequities that already exist and just like preventing her from really being able to have a true choice in what she does with her body. And so I think it's just about reframing this question a little bit. And it's recognizing reproductive justice as a social justice issue. And unfortunately addressing all of these things, right? Which is a huge feat, but it's really the only way that we're going to get to a state of equity.
Yeah, I appreciate that response, both in terms of reframing how we think about abortion and also acknowledging that, again, we need to work together to minimize harm and mitigate harm. For sake of time, I'm going to jump to the last question, which is, this person wrote, I volunteer with the Reproductive Justice Organization. We want to ensure we are being as inclusive and intersectional as possible with our work. Could you please provide some suggestions as to how we can do this?
Ask people who are affected by the issues the most. So it's people of color and low-income people to guide all of your decision making. Put them in leadership positions and have them determine the mission, determine the goals. That's huge.
Yeah, I was going to say you have to do the internal organizational work. If that also means, in addition to what Meera's saying, right, is doing a lot of the training, right? Move to End Violence, I want to name them, does some excellent work around, and also can help like in terms of consulting regarding how to think about these things, right? How to think about being anti-racist, being trauma-informed, really thinking about how are you impacting, but also supporting the most marginalized and how that can be reflected in your organizations and the work that you do.
Echoing that, connecting with organizations like HEART and Sakhi to inform some of your decision making and to inform a lot of your training, right? I'm probably signing us up for work. Sorry guys, but having conversations like this, right, prior to share knowledge and to make informed services, trauma informed services, and really like connecting with with folks that need this support, right, from different communities and not just targeting a particular population.
Yeah, thank you for those answers. I think we're gonna have to close there, just looking at the time. I wanted to mention one more thing. I saw a comment in the chat about something I mentioned earlier, which is pod mapping. Mia Mingus, the person who, alongside others, created the concept of pod mapping, and that's POD mapping, pod mapping, if you'd like to look into that more. It's really interesting. And Project Let's is a great organization also who's doing incredible work from a disability justice perspective around mental health, again, and weaving it all together. So looking at the time, I think we have to close there. Thank you so much, Nabila, Pooja, Dr. Shah. This has been incredible. I'm so grateful for your time and energy to this conversation, and to Sakhi. As a reminder, the book is available at the link in the chat. We suggest buying it from Bookshop so that you're supporting indie booksellers. And finally, I just wanted to share that as a reminder, if you or a loved one is looking for support, if anything has come up from this conversation, if there's anything on your mind that you would like to share with an advocate at Sakhi, please reach out to us at 212-868-6741. So thank you all and have a great night.
Thank you. This was so great.
You.
Thank you.
Bye.